It spoke as if we're going to start with the very first psalm in this collection. I said it's about Psalm 120 through 134. Actually, I want to start in Psalm 121, okay? I'm not going to continue this on forever, so I'm selecting different psalms here and there. So if you would, I want to read Psalm 121 for us, where the psalmist writes, I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your soul. The Lord will watch over your coming and your going, both now and forevermore. That's the second psalm in this collection, the Psalms of Ascent. One of the things that really stood out to me, I've mentioned this a little bit before, is that in the summer of 2000, when I did a study tour through Israel, one of the things that stood out to me was when I arrived there, I thought it was just going to be one long, dry, arid, hot desert kind of setting. And absolutely there are stretches like that in Israel if you ever go over there. I don't want to lie to you as if what I'm about to describe is around every corner, but there really are some places that are incredibly lush. In fact, the place where long traditionally they believe the Sermon on the Mount was preached by Jesus, it looks like Hawaii there. Actually, I've never been to Hawaii, but I've seen pictures, so it looks like Hawaii there. It's absolutely beautiful. There's really lush areas and lush valleys and hilly mountaintop kind of areas that are absolutely beautiful. But yeah, then you can turn the corner and you find yourself in completely different terrain. And then one of the things that stood out to me is you'd be in some lush area and you're traveling and everything's great and alive and vibrant and well hydrated, and then you're out in the desert and you're in the middle of the baking sun, and then all of a sudden you'll find yourself not just in some flatland desert area, but you will find yourself in mountainous, cavernous areas that you're just kind of pinned in this valley and looking up on them. This was the nature of traveling in the ancient culture, is that there would just be times where you would find yourself pinned in as a pilgrim just trying to make your way to Jerusalem for some celebration, and you realize these mountains are suddenly around you and it's intimidating and it's overwhelming, and in the ancient world it was just downright dangerous. Because in the ancient world, with the speed or lack thereof that you are traveling, you realize anybody and anything could be up, splayed out in the crags of those mountains just waiting to attack. Anything or anyone could be hidden, tucked away in some of the crevices of these mountains, and it was terrifying because you would realize there were thieves. In fact, this is the reason why the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan is so widely embraced by that culture at the time, and they just rolled with Jesus and the idea of some man traveling along the way and was suddenly attacked by thieves. It's because thieves were all along the path. It was incredibly dangerous. They were splayed out on those crags. They were tucked away in those crevices, just waiting to lay low someone, steal everything they have, if not take their very lives through beating them to death. It was terrifying to travel in ancient culture. And it's not, of course, even that, is that when they would find themselves in the midst of the mountain and they would recognize the things they've been taught since they were kids when they were traveling, which was eyes up, scan the mountains, keep your eyes out for enemies. It wasn't even just that, but to look up toward the mountains, even if you didn't spy someone splayed out on a crag or tucked away in a crevice waiting to attack you, you still had to deal with what in ancient culture really was public enemy number one, which was that ball of fire in the sky that was stripping you of hydration and was eating away at your skin, just beating down on you relentlessly. It was how many people died because of sun sickness, because of dehydration, because of just simply starving to death out in the midst of their travels. Traveling was terrifying. The mountains were terrifying. This is exactly why everything starts out in Psalm 121 with verse 1 when the psalmist says, I lift my eyes up to the mountains. I lift my eyes up because I know it's dangerous. I know there's enemies, there's men, and there's beasts, and there's the sun in the sky. I lift my eyes up to the mountain. And then it goes right into the next statement in the poetry. Where does my help come from? Because what the psalmist is saying is, when I travel, there's moments I round a corner and I feel like some pinned-in pilgrim and I don't have a chance. Because if they want to come down on me and attack me, there's very little I can do. I'm stuck, and I'm really right here, and there's no shade at all, and the sun's beating down on me. And so the psalmist is crying out in this poetry, I lift my eyes to the mountains because I know I am surrounded by these dangers that can strip me of life. Where does my help come from? The psalmist says. It's what all of Israel would have sung in the Psalms of Ascent as they're making their travels, and sometimes they make their way into the mountains. I can imagine that at moments the song leader at the front of the line would start to sing Psalm 121 because it's what everybody was thinking. I'm lifting my eyes up to these mountains. Now where's my help going to come from? Because this is dangerous. And of course, the psalmist is going much further than just talking about a literal journey here. It's the reason why this poetry speaks to us even if we're not out on the road, doesn't it? Because the Jews knew that even in the moments where they weren't making their way from their hometown to Jerusalem and they could find themselves in danger, they realized I could be sitting in my living room, in my home, in some small town, not even moving, not even traveling, but it's still incredibly dangerous. There's still, I guess you could say figuratively, metaphorically, these mountains that I suddenly find myself in. These moments where I have to determine, what am I going to say? How am I going to live my life? What's the next step that I take? And what the person realizes that I've not moved an inch, but I'm on a journey here because this is life. It's a world that is dangerous. I'm still lifting my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? Because you rummage around in the other poetry, the wisdom literature, some of the prophets of the Old Testament, the Jews realize public enemy number one's no man, it's no beast, it's no fireball in the sky. It is the one that we call the enemy, it's the one that we call the deceiver, it's the one we call the devil, it's the one they call the dragon, it's the one they call the Leviathan, it's the one that they call the beast. Because I only have to move an inch. And I feel the call of my childhood saying, eyes up, scan the mountains, because there is an enemy who's splayed out on the crags or hidden away in the crevices. And he doesn't just want to rob you or steal away from you or burn away your skin or strip you of your hydration. He wants to tear loose from you both body and soul. And so I imagine the psalmist realizes the same sentiment we have even now today, which is, you know what, life is a journey, and the reason that's a sentiment we love is because it's true. Life is a journey from beginning to end in a world that is incredibly dangerous, that goes well beyond when you're literally on some road somewhere because of an enemy who has set himself against us since the beginning of time. And so on a whole other level, the psalmist sings, and on a whole other level, Israel sings, I lift my eyes to the mountain. Where does my help come from? And they sing it with an even deeper shudder than they would even maybe when they're out on the road traveling to Jerusalem. Now for me, when I read Psalm 121, it's really easy for me to stay on that verse and to shudder. I lift my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? Because I know my enemy, and I feel like the older I get, the more I know my enemy and the more I sense his presence in my life and the devastation that can come because of just 5 seconds of this, that, or the other. You know, it's funny, in some ways I was debating whether or not to share this story because I don't know if it's going to make sense to you, but and if you're going to think I'm weird, but I remember a moment, and honestly, you got to realize how seriously I take this because it's been 21 years since this moment, and I can remember it really like it was yesterday. It was the summer after my sophomore year in high school. I was staying at my friend Trent's family's cabin up in Minnesota on Long Lake. We would go there in the summers and fish and go out on the boat. And there was one particular night where we took the boat out at night, and we weren't supposed to do that because actually the lighting on the boat was illegal, and we'd been told that, but Trent's dad and his stepmom were downtown, so we're like, let's take the boat out. So we took the boat out, and we were rushing back to the cabin to put everything away so that his dad and his stepmom could never know we were actually out on the water. So Trent went in, he was putting away some other stuff, and he asked me to go out to the shed and hang back up the life jackets that we had. Well, this shed was kind of down this little path, and I mean, it was in the middle of the night, and I was hurrying, but there's no lights out at this thing, right? And so I opened the door to the shed, and of course, the hooks for the life jackets are in the back of the shed, and Trent's dad was really meticulous. I couldn't just throw them in there. He would just get mad about that, and so there were no lights, but I just started to kind of inch my way to the back, right? And I was just feeling along the wall. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. And then all of a sudden outside, it had been a little windy. The wind just stops. And like the cicadas that were going, the roar of them just stops. And then I kid you not, all of a sudden, I don't know how, the door to the shed slammed shut. And I screamed like a girl. I mean, there's no way around it. In fact, the biggest memory I have about it is that Trent came running out of the cabin in his underwear. Like, what's wrong? Like, it was like Jamie Lee Curtis in Friday the 13th. I was terrified because what ended up happening, it wasn't just the door slamming shut, it's that there was just this really very real moment. Now, I know this might make me sound really weird to you, but it's been 21 years and I still remember this, that I was in that shed and I felt the very real, clear presence of evil. I just did. And I don't know what to do with that, but there was this moment where I realized there is something in here with me that wishes to do me great harm. And that was the moment where I screamed like a girl, and I started punching and kicking. I didn't care about fishing gear, I didn't care about work boots, anything that was in there. I came running out, almost run right into Trent in his underwear, which was awkward, and we just ran running into the cabin, scared to death. And I remember for a number of years after that, that I actually looked at that experience in Minnesota as something really very unique. Like I thought that was just one of those kind of one-time, all-time unique things. Someone, what's the scariest you've ever been? Oh, I know. Summer after my sophomore year, I was up in the cabin in Minnesota. I tell that story. And yet what's happened for me, the reason I'm sharing this story is because of this really very real, for the first time in my life, there is a presence of it, and you can feel it. And that there was a stretch of time in my life where I felt like that was really very unique. But the more I've tried to follow God closer, and the more and more I've tried to take risks for God, the more and more I've tried to live for God, the more and more I've tried to look like Christ instead of prevailing culture and even Christian culture, that I've begun to realize that feeling of the very real presence of evil is not unique, it is ubiquitous. It is all the time. That there have been so many moments where I have been about to say something and I have realized, it's almost the same feeling in Minnesota where I realize there is something going on here that's bigger than I realized, and it terrifies me. That I've realized there is someone who has gotten me clearly in their crosshairs, and that if I say this, or if I look at that, or if I do that, that it could mean all the difference for me. I feel this a lot in my life, the attacks. And so there are moments when I call to Psalm 121 and I can't get past that verse. I lift my eyes up to the mountains. Where does my help come from? Because it just feels like sometimes the attack is just constant and it's exhausting and it's overwhelming. And frankly, the guy, our enemy, the beast, the Leviathan, whatever word you want to use for it, feels really big and feels really powerful. And feels as though he's been given a lot of free range. And I shudder. I shudder. Because I realize I have an enemy who's splayed out on his own crags and tucked away in his own crevices, and he's waiting to pounce. I shudder, Israel shudders, you shudder. It's the next line, of course, where the psalmist says, okay, we've covered that. Let's settle the shudder. Let's still it. My help comes from the Lord. And man, this seems so simple, but it's huge that the psalmist uses the word the Lord. Look that up with synonyms, the master, the chief, the commander, the one in charge. Use whatever word you want. And what immediately happens is, in verse 1, you're terrified of an enemy. But in verse 2, the psalmist immediately says, but we have a Lord who is our great God, our great guard, the one who is far greater. And the one that roams this earth and looks to attack us, absolutely he has some power. And absolutely he has some influence. But no matter how hard he tries, he is subservient. He is under the one who is the Lord. And then I love the psalmist goes a step forward and says, my help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And the beauty of the people of Israel that are singing together of the Lord who is the maker of the heavens and the earth. So in one moment, they're staring up at the mountains and they're terrified as to what creation holds that can lay them low. And yet they immediately sing together that there is a greater God, and he's the one who actually made the mountains that terrify you. There would be no home for the enemy if it were not for him. It just is beautiful. And of course, it goes a step further, and you just continue to read the language, and you realize that what the psalmist is doing is trying to get all of Israel to sing and to watch that our great God, the guard, dismisses with very little effort on his part all of these public enemies that we have. He will not let your foot slip. I want to come back and show you the beauty of that. But going on, it says, he watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun will not harm you by day, nor the moon by night. No, the Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your soul. Do you hear how it just takes it all the way into the realm of all of evil, but also is talking about the sun? It's talking about the people who might be splayed out on the crags or tucked away in the crevices. The psalmist is saying, the Lord your God who made the heavens and the earth is guarding you against any single enemy that you can lay out before him. The psalmist goes even a step further, which is beautiful to say, and he never takes time off from this. There's never a moment where God is absent in our lives for his guardianship, because he emphasizes this in verses 3 and 4. He who watches over you will not slumber. Indeed, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. There's never a moment where God takes some kind of vacation, all this. So you're traveling? Well, I think I might travel too. No. He never slumbers. He never rests. But the great guardianship of God is ongoing. It is consistent. And the language that's used here and the verbiage and the grammar that's used here says, it is for now and forevermore. In fact, in verse 8, we'll come back to this in a moment, in which the psalmist says, this is for now and forevermore. So what ends up happening is we make this whole journey in the beauty of this poetry where we start out with just one verse. In our terror, I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? And then really you could rewrite the whole thing, because the psalmist says, okay, lift your eyes up to the mountain and you will realize your help comes from the Lord your God, maker of heaven and earth, the one who shades you from the sun, the one who chases away your enemies, the one who will reduce all of the enemies you lay out before him, both now and forevermore. And not just on your way to Jerusalem, but it is through your way in life that your God is your great guard. I mean, what it comes down here is this. This is where we have to start. This is the greatest traveling mercy of all the traveling mercies granted to us by God. It is his unrelenting guardianship, his protective presence in a terrifying, harmful world. It's the greatest of traveling mercies. It is why, and I come back to this, it is something I've said literally since the very first year that we started as a church, and I talked about this at Christmas time. It is why the most often repeated imperative in all of the Bible is do not be afraid. And this in a Bible that is littered with enemies. For the Lord your God, maker of heaven and earth, is your great guard at your side, to shade you, to chase away, to deliver you now and forevermore. Now, if you're anything like me, what happens for you is that you read a psalm like this, and even in the midst of all the beauty of it, you start to wrestle through, I have some problems with this psalm, though. Because this psalm, let's just say this together, this psalm makes some really bold promises, doesn't it? In fact, that's one of the things that's so hard for me in preaching the Psalms is because I realize just how much my own heart sometimes feels like the Psalms make some really bold promises, and maybe, just maybe, they flirt with over-promising. So the God that I serve will guard me now and forevermore. There are so many moments in our lives where we sit back and we think to ourselves, really? Because it sure seems like... I'll address that in just a moment, but the thing that's really significant for me in my heart is I really want to push you that even in the negative things that you can raise and the negative experiences and how you can point to headlines, I really want to push you where you need to take some time this week, and not even just week, but this is something we have to do in our lives, is that I think we need to acknowledge that even in the midst of pain, in the midst of all of that discomfort, that, man, we have to realize that God comes through a lot more than we give him credit for. And we focus so much on all these moments when we feel as if God has not come through that we miss the fact that the very fact that we can even say that or logically think that or piece that together is the fact that there is a God who's somehow sustaining and holding this world together, giving me enough space to actually come against him, to raise. Ends up happening, I think, is there have to be these moments where we stand back and we realize, I think there's been a lot of experiences in life that we realize. A lot of a lot more near misses in life. And I think if we would embrace the spiritual discipline of identifying and celebrating the near misses in life, that I think we would fall in love with God and recognize and embrace the promises of the Psalm. Is my mic even coming through this morning? Should we just cut sound? Because that's just kind of driving me.
Just use the handheld.
Okay, is that cool? One of the things I think we need to sit back is in the midst of all of our frustration, all the things we realize that it looks as though God has just not come through for us, is that I think we need to go back and go through, what was the moment you sought to start a relationship, but you reconsidered it, you didn't, and it's made all the difference in your life, in fact, a better difference in your life. Because I have good reason to believe that that is your great God, your guard, who somehow, some way, it might have been through the words of some fellow believer who confronted you and said, get it together, this is not the best report. Somehow, some way, that he's been able to make sure there is a near miss on the enemy's fire. Or maybe it's the opposite of that. You know, the moment that you sought to end your relationship, but you reconsidered and didn't, and it's made all the difference in your life, a better difference in life. I have good reason to believe that is your God who is your guard. And in all the other moments that you realize and you think, man, it just seems like he hasn't come through, that there's so many more moments like that. Or the moment where you opened your mouth to speak, but you reconsidered, and you did it, and it's made all the difference in your life. Or what about the moment you kept your mouth shut, but you reconsidered by the influence, I think, of God, and instead you opened wide and you spoke, and it's made all the difference in your life. What about the moment you sought to look at this, or look at that, but you reconsidered, and you did it, and it's made all the difference in your life? What about the moment you sought to camp out and thought about this or about that, but you reconsidered by the grace of God and you did it, and it has made all the difference in your life? All of these reunion are near misses on the enemy's part, but the hand of God will shelter. There is no other way, according to the Psalm, for you to do that. That was not by your power, that was not by the power of someone else influencing your life, but instead that was God influencing you, or God using someone to influence you. It was his protective hand. It was the one who said, when you look to the mountains, he said, I am the maker of heaven and earth, and I will hold you in my hand, and I will steer you through this. If we would just take the moment to embrace what I would call the spiritual discipline of remembering, identifying and remembering, celebrating these near misses, I think the psalm will come alive, and it will still your voice for a moment and realize how great is our God, and how far and how high and how wide and how deep has his protection. But at the same time, I also recognize there's moments where we feel as though, okay, that's nice, Brian, for us to identify and celebrate the near misses of the enemy, but I really do get frustrated by the moments where it feels like it's the near misses of God. You know, the enemy's been able to score a direct hit because God just didn't seem to get there in time, or He just didn't come through. What about all those things? And those are terribly difficult. And I've told you before in sermons many times where I realize a lot of that is just life around us trying to entangle that in David over the moments that we'll never quite understand. Life things unfolded the way that they unfolded. But I think even the moments where it feels like the enemy has been able to lay some direct hits on us, I think we will nonetheless I would boldly say that I think all the prophecies of Psalm 121 are absolutely true. I think they are true, just as the psalmist says, for God is firm in verse 8, that they are true now and they are true forever. Two thoughts. The first one is this. I really do think, now this is a hard word, and this isn't pleasant for me and it's not pleasant for you. But I honestly think sober reflection, a lot of times we feel we've had a direct hit from the enemy. I think sober reflection will often find that much of what we perceive as a near miss on God's part with regard to His protection is really a near miss on our part with regard to accepting His protection. You and I know that there are moments in our lives where if we really stop and think about soberly, get over our arrogance, get over our pride, get over all the arguments that we want to make before God, that if we really look at certain situations in which we're standing in something that is just complete and utter devastation, I'm not going to say this happens always, but a lot of times, we would be able to look back and pinpoint these amazing moments where God was clearly trying to say, and I have those moments, and you have those moments too, we know we do. And yet in those moments, what we will often do is we will open up. You said, Psalm 121, you were going to guard. You were going to guard me. And I think there's moments where I am just startled that God doesn't smite us all dead. Because He always sits there and says, do you realize all the things I did to try and tell you, don't go that way. Now in my freedom that I have offered you, I let you go that way. But I sent brothers and sisters who were crying out to you and trying to help you. I was working your thoughts. I was working through Scripture, and you kept emphatically saying, no. But I think if we're honest, a lot of times when we say, what happened? What gives here? Where is God? Where was His guardianship? That if we actually took the time to do some sober reflection, we would realize just how much effort our dear, grace-filled God made to protect us. He pushed away His hand and He said, let me help you so your foot does not slip. Well, He was providing shade and we stepped outside of it back into the sun and said, no thanks. I'm not saying all of us, but I do think that's not our God. It's not against the promises of Psalm 121. It's on us. We have to soberly embrace it. But I do think it goes deeper than that, and it gets into some other hard words as well. This is a very important point that I want to make here. And I'm riffing a little bit on something that I said a few weeks ago when I was preaching John chapter 2 of the wedding of Cana and the turning of water and wine. The absence of one form of God's protection does not mean there was no protection at all in God's part. Okay? The absence of one form of protection on God's part, and probably the form that we most desire, does not mean that God was not protecting us at all. So I've talked about this before as human beings. We get locked in on one thought. We're like, this is clearly what God needs to do. And so if that doesn't happen, what do we say? Where'd you go, God? Psalm 121, you said, now forevermore. What's been very helpful to me are two particular verses. Been very helpful. What's not been helpful is that I don't think they're translated, especially well in most translations. Verse 3, really when you mash all the Hebrew together, it should read, you will not, it usually reads, let your foot slip. But it's actually, you will not let your footing be moved. It's the idea of someone who is resolutely planted. It is a foundation. It is the idea, it's kind of ironic because it's a traveling song, but it's the idea of a foundation has been established and it will not be moved.
And when I take the beauty of that language and then trace it alongside of Psalm chapter 121, verse 7, and usually it says the Lord will watch over your life. The Hebrew word that's used there is actually, the word will not watch over your soul. Your soul. It's not just the promises of our physical well-being, but when you bring 3 and 7 together, it's this idea where the psalmist is saying that these promises will always be true, ultimately, anyway. That what it means is that when your journey is coming to an end, there is not a moment where your great enemy can snatch from God's hand your salvation, your eternal. We're talking about the stuff of eternity here, okay? And so what happens is we have to begin to realize that there are moments where the one form of protection we wish we could have. We might not see it, there might be the absence of that. But that does not negate that God holds us in His hand. And the Scripture tells us clearly, the enemy cannot pluck us from His hand. This is done once for all through Jesus Christ. This is a beautiful thing. Some of us are crying out for a loved one who's dying. We want that kind of form of protection. What ends up happening is having to drop your hands to the side and raise them again in worship to recognize I am so grateful that in all the pain and all the suffering, God guided me through the valley of that which is there will be an eternity for them that we did not be able to protect. That is protection. So the psalmist's words are true, if at the very least ultimately, but I don't want to do some cheap way out saying, well, really this is true because it means ultimately it's true. That's cheap, that's lame, because the psalmist says in verse 8, the Lord will watch over your coming both now and forevermore. And what this all really comes down to, again, I'm coming back to this point, the absence of one form of protection does not negate another form of protection that God might be able to work at. And this is the idea that I'm getting at in all of this, is that in the moment where I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, man, it just seems like I'm not getting the protection of God. But then I remind myself, I'm always getting the protection of God. If ultimately the protection is keeping me safe for an eternity, for my overall salvation, then that makes me go back to the situation and realize, is it possible He's not protecting me to protect me? And that's a hard thing to do. Happens. Church of England believes it's true that when you read Scripture, you can't interpret it in one way that makes another Scripture repugnant, drugs. It seems like they're conflicting thoughts. Here's what's interesting. You read the rest of Scripture, there's no point where God even promises, and there will be no trials, no heartache, no trouble. But in all of those moments where there is a promise from Jesus Christ Himself in this world, you will have trouble. Always goes a step forward to say there are moments in which God will hold back on some form of protection. The best way we can move forward and recognize maybe it is that He is actually trying to protect me on that greater level. You know this here in James chapter 1. Consider the pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish this work so that you can be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Look at verse 12. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. See, there's no promise of no trial. Blessed is the one who does have trial, perseveres under the trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love Him. You see this idea of the greater protection that's happening, even the moments where God maybe even His grace withdraws His protection. You see what I'm doing? Can't create this conflict between the different protections of God. There's just this moment, it's painful, and sometimes it is a lifetime of searching. But you realize in some of the deepest, darkest moments when you're crying out, where are you, God? Or with the psalmist, how long, O Lord, until you deliver me? That we look back on these moments and we realize that without them, our faith would have faltered altogether, and His protection would have failed on the deepest, most profound level. In a sense, it doesn't really know because I want to talk about more because it's huge. It's hard. It's painful. It's huge. But the psalm is not over-promising. It's giving beautiful promise. Perhaps it's the point of God's protection. I'm going to stop.